Okay, good afternoon. Our topic for our group presentation was an economic discussion if college athletes should be paid, looking at the pros and cons for both of them along at the university level, and then how it affects the economy and how the government should be involved in that, or if they should not be at all. California recently passed the Fair Pay to Play Act, which will take effect January 2023. This act is basically a game changer in sports, and it says that it's illegal for California colleges to deny their student athletes opportunity to gain compensation for the use of their names, images, or likeliness. Now, this isn't saying that the student athletes are going to be paid for being a student athlete, being on a team sport. It does say they'll be compensated for their name being used for apparel, for promotional material, video games, anything like that. Currently, the NCAA would gain this profit, so this is saying the student athlete would gain it instead of the NCAA or a third party. It's the first act of the kind to really pass. It won't take effect for a couple of years, but it'll really be a game changer in the way that college sports happen and college teams are put together and the athletes themselves.
So we began with talking about the pros of if college students were to be paid. One of the first pros would be that from an athlete standpoint, this would be good for them because the NCAA makes a profit off of an athlete's name and likeness, especially during tournaments, gameplay, everything like that. And they believe that they should be given a portion of this. In addition, there was CNBC conducted a college pulse study that athletes were supposed to include whether the salary should be given across the board or only to sports that bring in revenue for the college. And so 60% of them said that salary should be given to all athletes, and 38% said that they should be given to only athletes in sports that bring in revenue.
And then another pro for paying college athletes is the large amount of revenue that the NCAA makes off of those athletes. The NCAA exploits student athletes by not paying them. It's estimated that in 2016, the NCAA made $995.9 million. This would have been more than enough to compensate players for their time playing, practicing, traveling, conditioning, and etc. Then we also have the opportunity cost and scholarships. The economic value of scholarships is greater than working a regular job. So the opportunity cost for time spent training in exchange for the waiver of the crippling debt that comes with college education cannot be offset by a work-study job that pays minimum wage.
Okay, so Brenda and Anna just talked about some of the pros for paying college athletes. The main argument for student athletes to be paid a profit is because someone else is currently gaining the profit off of their work, basically. They go to work, they do their practice, they go to games, they travel, all while handling academics, which basically, if you total up the amount of hours, goes into about the same as a college job, if not more, while also representing their school and having the pressure to be successful on the team. Brenda called out how student athletes are really exploited by the NCAA and people making profit off of them. So while there isn't a ton of pros that we can say this will happen because the student athletes are being paid, it's because it hasn't happened yet. So now we're going to move into the kind of the argument for student athletes not to be paid currently.
So a couple of cons from last word on pro basketball. So the big D1 schools, they would start to take over from the smaller D1 and then also the D2 and D3 schools, because the other smaller schools would not have the money to keep up with the bigger schools. to keep paying the players and keep up with all the other expenses, and this would create a monopoly effect, which is not good. And then this, and also like the major higher skilled players, they would also get higher, like better schools would be looking for them, and they would get better and better stuff. But then the less skilled players or the athletes that are just right now just barely getting into the D1 schools, they would kind of lose those schools and then have to go into a D2 or D3 school because they would not be worth being paid for or as much. And then at a college, the football and men's basketball are the only sports that make money. So having this to pay athletes that are not in football and men's basketball, that just decrease that sport even more. So it'd be harder for schools to keep up with all the sports. And then this would also not be good for the coaches because NBA head coach Greg Popovich, which he's a head coach for the Spurs, his salary was worth 4.7% of the San Antonio Spurs revenue. So this would they would also have to make coaches pay cut. They would have to do a pay cut on them to keep up with paying the other players.
And this brings us to compensation for labor and economic value of the athlete's labor versus the other alternatives such as working a job. In an argument based on pure compensation of labor, we must talk about the economic value of an athlete's labor in comparison with alternatives. So the average out-of-state tuition cost for the 2018/2019 school year was $21,629 for public school and $35,676 for private school. An athlete on full ride scholarship at Duke University, which is a basketball powerhouse, will avoid paying roughly $235,000 in debt for a top-notch education. I believe this is worthy compensation for putting in several years of hard work to become the player with a high caliber to be recruited by Duke in the first place. So the economic value of scholarship is greater than what many students will make working a regular job. And this means that the opportunity cost for time spent training in exchange for the waiver of crippling debt cannot be offset by a work-study job that pays minimum wage minus taxes.
Another con that we discussed was that college athletes should be focused on their academics first, and that a salary during college and college athletics could push these athletes further away from their academics. And so that would be concerning. Mark Emmert, the NCAA president, was very vocal on this, and he said that college athletics is about college students playing other college students, not employees playing employees. And so this is something that no matter what, if we give them a compensation, we could see the effects of pushing them further away from their academics.
On top of that, with the article from New York Times that I found, the NCAA was worried publicly about the prospect of a patchwork of laws, and it feared that it could undermine rules that apply to colleges nationwide, that being with conferences and national championships, contenders coming with many from all different states and all around the world. With that as well, there is a debate, adding on that point, if they can use the government to intervene and to find that fund to give that money to the athletes to pay them. And then ending with that, adding Congress could also change the business model and the structure of college sports altogether, and that profit structure as well.
So another point to bring up, and an article from the DP brought up that how are we going to make sure we're paying college athletes by sports paid equally? How are we going to make sure a football player or a basketball player are making the same as a track and field athlete. Where football and basketball tend to bring in more profit, or the only two sports that make a profit, but how are we going to make sure all those student athletes are being paid and they're being paid equally? Or are we going to just look at doing the sports that bring in a profit are the student athletes who would be paid? So now we're going to just move into some other points that we found that really wouldn't fall into the pros or the cons of if student athletes should be paid, just other things to be considered in this argument.
Yes, so the first point that we would want to consider would be really the market value for different players' positions and how that should relate to the salary that they make. So for example, in football, you have the quarterback versus the punter, and in basketball, you have the point guard versus the post. And so like, how would you put a value at the salary they should earn based on the position they play? And so that would oftentimes affect their given salary. And so we should think about that when we're thinking about implementing a salary for athletes.
Another thought to consider, so having the higher wages to pay the players, that would also cause other benefits to decrease. So for example, like different uniforms, or like schools always getting newer and nicer uniforms, they probably wouldn't be able to get those uniforms as frequent or as much of them. So other benefits would decrease because the players would have to be paid. So it's kind of a trade-off of whether or not they want to pay more to the players or they want to have the benefits increase.
So now that we've talked about the other points, we will move into the economic analysis of should we pay college athletes? So the first thing that we have to recognize is that this program or salary-based college athletes has not actually happened or been fully implemented yet. California has the Fair Play Act that'll take place in 2023, but we don't know how this would actually affect the profit structure of athletics yet, and but we do know it will take some effect. So it's important that we look at that, and that no matter what, we recognize that right now there may be more cons than pros. And yes, so that is the first thing we need to do.
Okay, so up on the screen there is a direct quote that we kind of wanted to bring to wrap it all together from last word on pro basketball. And it says, in all, the economic and logistical impact of paying college athletes suggests it is not worth it. If folks truly want to see college athletes receive wages, there should be a motivation to organize and collectively bargain, assuming they gain the right to unionize. College athletes should then organize to put pressure on the NCAA. And this is something that, as we were doing our research and looking into this at all stances, that really just stood out to us on kind of bringing it all together. So as we kind of mentioned throughout, this is something that's really hard to know. Should we do it? Should we not? There are pros to paying college athletes. Yes, those students are putting in the work. Yes, somebody else is profiting off of their identity. Video games are being made. There's promotional material, all kinds of things across the board that you think of, that you see, even when you think of college game day and college football, all of the things you're seeing from those big D1 schools with the athletes' names that you know. Somebody else is making a profit off that, not the student. Meanwhile, if you're looking for student athletes not to be paid, technically college athletes are there. Yes, they are college athletes. They hope to someday join the professional league, but they're also there for academics and their students and getting an education. So should we be paying them and encouraging them not to pursue their education, instead pursue athletics, when the amount of students that actually become pro athletes is very, very small? We want to thank you today for taking the time to listen to our presentation. We're very interested what your thoughts are. Do you think student athletes should be paid or not? And something to think about looking at these. We do have our works cited here just for your reference to view, and we want to thank you again and have a great day.